From the STMM Digital Studio, welcome to the Ricky Mathews Show, where we celebrate the people who are making Mississippi such a great place to live, work, and play. Hey, listen, I had a great show yesterday with James Wynn, the Vice President of Digital for STMM Digital. So if you missed it, go take a look at it, especially if you're a business owner. We do a sort of a pretty detailed breakdown of the various digital platforms, and in case of SuperTalk Mississippi Media, how it sort of integrates well with radio. But it helps you understand some of the things you need to be thinking about from a digital perspective. So if you missed that, you can go to Facebook or YouTube or your favorite podcast and take a listen. You'll very much enjoy, kind of hearing from James and my perspective what the sort of digital advertising world looks like these days. Of course, yesterday was the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. 18 years. 18 years. I had the opportunity to join Paul Gallo in a show yesterday, and I recalled something I wrote in the foreword to Haley Barbour's book where I said the previously unimaginable became the undeniable reality as it relates to Katrina. You know, our wildest imagination, we could have never expected what Katrina delivered to us, and in so many different ways. We were challenged, and as we watch Idalia, the hurricane going through Florida as we speak, and the reality is it will take some time to do damage assessment. I know that a lot of people in coastal Mississippi have a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome as they watch that storm go in there, and then, imagine what it would be like if it were headed here. And I actually had someone drop me a note the other day that said, "Thank me," because on my personal Facebook page, I will post some knowledge that I have about tropical systems, and I often say that I'm not a hyper. Hypers are going to hype, but I don't. And family members and close friends sort of lean on me a little bit because over the past 30 years, I've paid a lot of attention to tropical weather, and I give my take on it, and I tell when I think there's something out there for us to worry about, But this listener sent me a note and said that she was wish that these hypers wouldn't do that. They wouldn't get us all concerned about something so they would get the click, so to speak, because people in coastal Mississippi do have post-traumatic stress syndrome, and just the thought that something may be coming here or maybe it's being overhyped makes them more nervous. And she was just saying she appreciated the approach that I took. I'll share some of my posts occasionally at the Ricky Mathews Facebook page, but most of the time it's just, to my personal friends and my family. And, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when we're going to get hit again. And we just need to stay tuned. But I know that watching Idalia creates a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome reaction to a lot of people in coastal Mississippi, and for good reason. I get that completely. Listen, as I look back on Hurricane Katrina, I can't help but reflect a lot about it, and did a lot of that yesterday with Paul, but I want to do more of it now. So I couldn't think of a better person to bring on board than my friend Ashley Edwards, the former CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council. He worked for Haley Barbour in the recovery office for a number of years afterwards, and he's actually an entrepreneur in sort of the recovery business for communities across the United States now. This is his area of expertise, but he really cut his teeth in the post-Katrina world, and we're gonna chat about that. Ashley is also, incidentally, a contributing columnist to SuperTalk Mississippi Media, and we may take some time to talk about his last couple of columns, which were terrific, about how the situation in Mississippi, the recent election, might be a harbinger to what's to come for America. But without any further ado, let me welcome my friend Ashley Edwards back to the Ricky Mathews Show. How you doing, Ashley?
Hey, I'm doing great. Good morning, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
So I know that you actually own some property down in the path of the storm, and it will be some time before I guess you can get an assessment done. And you're also working with communities down there that have been impacted by Michael and Ian. And Florida's about to have to go through another rebuilding effort. But, you can't, you heard what I said. Mississippians can't watch what's happening in Florida and not feel for the people in Florida and not have some kind of visceral reaction because of our experience after Hurricane Katrina. You hear it all the time, don't you?
You do. I completely agree with you. I mean, it's every time we see a storm warning, our antennas go up a lot faster than a lot of other people, because once you've lived through a devastating storm event, You're always sort of looking in the rearview mirror to see when is the next one coming after you. And thankfully, we're going to miss out on this one, and thankfully, it's been a quiet season so far. But look, people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast should know this area of Florida is very, very similar to home. This is not the part of Florida where you have the big metropolises, and although those areas along Florida's west coast are likely going to get quite a bit of surge impact. But this area of Florida and the Big Bend is a very similar coastline, a very shallow shelf with the Florida escarpment coming off of the coastline, really stacks the storm surge up in there. In fact, I remember back after Katrina being with a group of researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they were looking into, why were the Katrina surge models saying 14, 15 feet, and then we had 25 to 30 feet in some areas. And so they were looking at why did the slosh models underperform back in 2005. And I remember them talking about then the fact the Big Bend of Florida was the most vulnerable coastline in America to storm surge and one of the most vulnerable coastlines in the world. The difference is they've not had a major hurricane impact since 1856, when all of the records began being kept in the antiquity of Florida. So you're dealing with generations of people who have not experienced something like this, generations of construction habits, generations of decisions not to elevate properties. So you're talking about an area that's really primed for very, very significant impacts. And I'm sure that the people of Mississippi Gulf Coast are going to be watching the national news over the next few days and seeing a lot of scenes that bring back a lot of memories.
I know that it is. Your point about what was called the slosh models. These are the models that estimate what, based on a storm and where the storm is hitting and all the dynamics of the storm, what the storm surge is going to be. But after Katrina, they went back and rewrote the book on this, and they realized that the category approach to surge was not the appropriate approach. That the size of the storm is what makes the most difference. A small storm like Camille, for example, Category 5 storm, isn't going to have the same kind of outgrowth of surge that, for example, a storm like Katrina, which was once a 5 but only a 3 when it hit. But because it was such a large storm and the central pressures were so low, it may be that the winds go down, but the pressure doesn't follow. It's just driving this incredible wall of water, which we saw after Hurricane Katrina. This is one of the reasons. I know this is part of the National Flood Insurance 2.0 thinking to some extent, but the reality is we were unfairly targeted, I guess is a great way to say it, because the surge happened to happen here. It drove up the requirements for building for us because that's where the storm hit. But because they can now model for every community, it seemed like they should have this modeled Katrina for every community and then began building appropriately for that kind of storm. But instead what they do is they wait until you get hit, and then then the rules start to change. That seems extremely unfair. But at the end of the day, we had numerous editorial boards of National Hurricane Center, National Weather Service, and especially FEMA. And I was on a tear as a publisher, both here and when I left in Mobile and New Orleans, to make sure that they followed through rapidly on how they did surge warnings going forward, because too many people died in Hurricane Katrina because the models were not right, as you pointed out just a few minutes ago. And it took a little bit of time. It took longer than I would have liked them to, but they've gotten better at it. We'll find out. We will soon find out that by doing the assessment of the Big Bend area, how close the models were to reality. It's going to be very interesting, isn't it?
It is, and I think that right now the safe money is that, some of these surge areas, especially just to the right of the center, are going to probably even overperform where the models were. And people look at these hurricanes, they think about wind impacts, they look at the size of the wind field. For a coastline like this where there's really nowhere for the water to diffuse, it's running up creek channels, it's running up river channels, it's running up bays. People have been building on the ground in these areas for 100 years without a storm to come along and tell them not to. So, significant damage in this storm's wake, no question.
Well, look, for Katrina, once the assessment was done 5 years after Katrina, there were 486,000 insurance claims totaling $12 billion. And man, as you well know, that was just the beginning, because then you started talking about infrastructure and all the other requirements that we had that led to tens of billions of dollars. You know, there were some estimates on this storm right off the bat that it's going to be a $50 billion storm, maybe even more. That's the one estimate that I heard. Hey, when we come back with Ashley, we're going to reflect just a little bit more about Hurricane Katrina, the path that we've taken to recovery and renewal, and look back just a little bit. We'll continue the conversation with my friend Ashley Edwards after we return after this break. Welcome back to the Ricky Mathews Show. I have my friend Ashley Edwards, the former CEO of the Coast Business Council. He actually worked in a very important role in Haley Barbour and then Governor Phil Bryant's recovery office. Became a bit of an expert when it comes to grants and the role that states and federal government and local governments play in a recovery effort over the long haul after a storm like Katrina. In fact, Ashley would tell you that there are things still underway in coastal Mississippi today related to Hurricane Katrina. It's amazing how long it takes and how much money it takes, isn't it, Ashley?
It is amazing. We have a lot of clients right now who are very early in their hurricane recovery process. We're working with some communities that experienced impacts from Hurricane Michael a number of years ago, and they're a little farther along. And then the guys down in Fort Myers Beach that, just experienced Hurricane Ian last year. And I think sometimes when I tell them, look, it's 18 years after Hurricane Katrina and there's still programs and money being spent in Mississippi, it gives them a little bit of pause to think of how long of a marathon these hurricane recoveries really are. But they're also incredible opportunities for communities, because in many cases, there aren't situations or events that create the type of infusion of recovery capital and private sector investment. And so doing that the right way can mean that not only do you get your community back to where it was when the hurricane made landfall, but you get it well beyond that, and you make sure it's more resilient against future hurricanes as they come forward. And that's certainly the story of Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi.
It really is. Look, you heard how I said it. The previously unimaginable became the undeniable reality as we all sort of assessed where we were after Hurricane Katrina. 70,000 housing units destroyed, 160,000 damaged. I thought it was interesting just to look specifically at the number of people, 2.5 million without power. 3 million people had no phones. The list goes on. 238 deaths, thousands that were injured. This storm impacted lives in so many different ways. And in this show over the 3 years that I've had this show, so many of the conversations have to do with pre-Katrina and post-Katrina, the opportunities that were brought to us. Haley used to say, as you well know, that this yin-yang Chinese symbol for opportunity was also disaster. And that's true, that in this disaster, there were a lot of opportunities. We had to work together to bring that together. But, rebuilding the infrastructure that continues as we speak today, and the renewal of coastal Mississippi is really centered around what you just said, and that is that it gives you the opportunity to build resiliency into your infrastructure so that next time you don't have all your bridges going down. Next time you don't have all your sewage and water systems going down, because you've built resilience. The same thing's true with the power companies. They've done so much in the past 18 years to make it so they can turn on the dime with the innovation they've deployed with power companies and so on. But the reality still is poles are going to go down, lines are going to go down, and the cavalry is going to have to parachute in from power companies all over the United States to help us if we get hit again. And certainly in the case of Florida, you'll see an immense number of power folks in those communities that were hardest hit. That's going to be a wide swath of damage in that community. But when you look at where we were in the days that followed Hurricane Katrina, and you look at where we are today, it's truly remarkable, isn't it?
It is, Ricky, and what it always makes me think about is sort of the comparison between Hurricane Camille in 1969 and Katrina in 2005. 1969, the United States did not have a disaster recovery infrastructure anywhere like it is today federally. And when you really take a deep dive into what did Katrina destroy and what did we rebuild, in many cases, what Katrina took away were a lot of the unsustainable development decisions and buildings that were built in Hurricane Camille's wake. You sort of put it through the test of, if Katrina hit us today, exactly the same way it did in 2005, what would be the difference between what was damaged today and what was damaged in 2005? And it would still be devastating, but it would be nothing like what we experienced in 2005. And so in many ways, that becomes sort of the true credit of the recovery effort, which is you've prepared yourself to be more resilient to these types of impact. As you have pointed out absolutely correctly a number of times on your show, this is not a question of if, it's a question of when. We will get another major storm impact. Now, hopefully none of us are still around to see it. That's certainly possible, but it's also very unlikely given the way that these are spaced out by years. And so, it's always having that goal in mind, which is, look, we live in coastal America. We live in a place that is very vulnerable to the impacts of storm surge and tropical systems. And so we have to build our communities in a way to ensure that when those things happen as they do, that it's not going to knock us down flat like it did after Katrina, but that it's going to give us a challenge that we can overcome. And again, this, Ricky, it's a marathon. I mean, I look at these communities that we work with that have been impacted by various disasters, whether they be tornadoes or hurricanes, and the immensity. I mean, for someone who lost their home or someone who was, lost their place of business, they understand the incredible personal impacts, and it's something that never leaves you. When you work with these communities and you start to dive in and you see just the breadth and the depth of the stories out there and the people that lost things and the infrastructure that was lost and the sewer lines that are filled with sedimentation and the water lines that are scoured out. I mean, in some cases, it's like you're rebuilding these communities from scratch. That was certainly the case in Waveland or the waterfront of Bay St. Louis or Pass Christian. And I don't think even people locally sometimes really fully understand the extent of the investment and the rebuilding that occurred. And look, everybody that had a hand in that, whether it's a local citizen or a local official, a state legislator, local business owners, they should be very, very proud of what happened in the state of Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina, because it is today truly one of the success stories for the best practices in post-disaster recovery. And people talk about Katrina all over the country that talk about how to do it the right way.
Listen, as you know, this is not a political show. You did write a couple of articles recently, opinion pieces for SuperTalk that had to do with what we learned during the election and kind of evaluating who won and who lost. And more recently, you wrote one about the debates. And if we have time, we'll go into some of those. But I do want to actually zero in on one aspect of this. If you think about what I wrote in the book America's Great Storm about Haley Barbour, was he was a man made for that moment. He was a man literally made for that moment. And I cannot imagine going through that with anyone else. No slight to any other leader, but I was just thinking about the incredible bipartisan work that he did in in Washington, and the work that he did here locally, and how that it resulted in the kind of recovery that we've all, appreciated and enjoyed. But then I look over in Florida and I think, okay, so the political dimension to this is going to be pretty interesting, because you've seen Trump's numbers fall 6 or 7 points actually since the debate. You've seen other numbers go up, like Nikki Haley and DeSantis. To what extent will this storm actually create a real moment for DeSantis, for America to watch him and assess really his ability to handle situations when the going gets tough? And my sense is he'll probably shine, because he's kind of a detailed guy, and that's what he does really well. It kind of reminds me of Governor Jindal to some extent, the way Jindal knew all these facts and could do them, in the path of a storm, in the immediate aftermath of a storm. But it will be interesting to watch how that plays out, won't it?
It will be. It's something I've thought a lot about really ever since we started seeing models saying that there might be a storm that hit Florida. I mean, you think about in the heat of a presidential primary where DeSantis has faltered a bit over time in his poll numbers, but sort of came out of the gate very strong. And what that's indicative of is there are a lot of folks that really appreciated the work that he had done as governor. That's a little bit different than having to go out on the trail and be a retail politician. You know, it's rare that you find a Haley Barbour who is both a masterclass politician and incredible at policy and governing. A lot of times, in my experience, people that are good at one are not necessarily good at the other one. And, you know, there's no question that DeSantis has made his mark and really he's created interest among the Republican base from what he has done governing a state. And so he is about to be center stage in the United States being a governor. And if you're DeSantis in the DeSantis camp, that is probably politically where you are going to be at your best. And so there's no question that events like this that are, you know, unknown, that we can't be predicted, they can have big impacts on a presidential race.
Yeah, I said about Haley that his style was disarming, perhaps even an invitation to underestimate him, which serves him well in complicated negotiations to advance the goals of Mississippi's communities and needs. But it's only a temporary advantage, though, because anyone who has seen Haley in action comes to respect his extraordinary capacities as a leader and a thinker. And then I went on to say, behind that friendly, confident exterior is a man with a mind like a steel trap. There's a driven man who is often 5 steps ahead of most of us. There's a leader who has an extraordinary ability to inspire others. And as a political insider across the ideological spectrum can attest, Haley's understanding of the levers of power, and as a result, his access to those levers is unparalleled. Anyway, when we come back on the other side, we'll continue our conversation with Ashley Edwards. Welcome back to the Ricky Mathews Show. I have my friend Ashley Edwards, and when we were talking, again, this is not a political show, but it's hard not to mention this, especially given the fact that Ashley wrote a piece about the debate, sort of some observations about the debate after the most recent Republican debate. It's hard not to look at the political dimension that's going to play out in Florida, and it will be very interesting because, you know, depending on what Florida's needs are, can sort of this polarizing figure in DeSantis create a moment for bipartisan support around whatever their needs are going to be, especially during sort of this, you know, this presidential election situation? It's going to be tough. That's going to be a big challenge for him, don't you think?
It's going to be tough, and you think about sort of the competing interests here. I mean, you know, the Biden administration is going to have sort of a lot of stake in making sure that they show a strong response, and that, you know, hey, the federal government is here, and just sort of the interplay between those two and the political rivalries that exist as a result of an election are going to be interesting. On the same note, if you're the Biden administration, you're a little hamstrung, because the last thing you can do is appear to not be giving Florida what they need or not be extending a helping hand. And if you're DeSantis, you can absolutely pound them on everything that they get wrong. I mean, you know, you think about Katrina, and we don't have to rehash it, but there's no question the federal response, especially on the early days, left a lot to be desired. Now, over time, the federal government really got their act together. But, you know, you had President Bush in the White House, Governor Barbour, who had been in office for 2 years. So there was a lot of cooperation between both the federal government and the White House and the state government in trying to sort of get all these wheels turning early on. Ricky, the book that you wrote the foreword for really is a masterclass in how you move the wheels of government and politics to create outcomes after a disaster. And, you know, DeSantis understands that. He's going to be in that position. Biden administration is going to be in a position where they want to look good, don't want DeSantis to look good, but they can't really do anything to be impediment. So what a fascinating political situation, all wrapped around this natural disaster that's happening, you know, as we speak.
Can DeSantis be magnanimous? Can Biden be magnanimous? So much to watch. But you know what? It's interesting. Again, I have to make this observation that I had the opportunity to meet with President Bush on a number of occasions because I was on the executive committee for the recovery effort, and Haley had a tendency to want to include several of us in those meetings. And what I observed in President Bush was a man who always had his legal pad with him and took copious notes. He was listening carefully. He had his team around him. He loved to sit for, hour or two and just hear from leaders in the community so that he could understand how he was dealing with how the federal government could assist in Mississippi's recovery. I don't think, as you pointed out, I think in the immediate days, day 2, 3, 4, maybe after the storm, the federal government was still trying to understand the situation. I think the FEMA director at the time didn't have a good handle on the situation, unfortunately, and unfortunately, President Bush was getting his guidance on sort of how to deal with it from him. The now famous picture of him flying over in Air Force One, flying over New Orleans, and how the media treated him as a result of that. And I compare it to Biden's most recent situation in Hawaii, where what he has done and said, the lack of empathy. Again, I'm trying not to be too critical here, but the reality, it is what it is. What I observed in President Bush was a man who cared deeply for us and was doing everything in his power to help us over the long haul. And I just don't think the media is fair at all when they deal with situations like that. So you've got whatever that is that divides America, that too many in mainstream media control. It will be interesting to how they play that wedge between DeSantis and Biden. It's just going to be interesting, buddy. There's so many subplots to this that in fact there's so many we're not going to be able to keep up with them all.
No, you're not. And you're going to start to hear things that have not made media attention, just given all the things that are going on out there in America and in the world right now. But already after Hurricane Ian last year, you start to see how these things have gone. The Biden administration has actually made direct appropriations to counties in some cases, rather than sending the Ian recovery money through the state of Florida. So it's been, hey, the federal government's here to help. We're going to put the money right into the hands of the local governments rather than letting the state government kind of control it. And that's not always a real workable solution. And so, politics gets in the way of governing. I write a lot about politics. I don't particularly care for the fact that politics is often the worst of us when you need statesmanship and you need people that are pragmatic in governing. But the truth of the matter is, a disaster like this, it requires people to work together and find alignment and coordinate and communicate. And the politics of the day push the exact opposite agenda. So these are fascinating times in American history when you have situations like this occur in the middle of what is, one of the nastiest presidential elections in American history.
Hey, one of the things that I want to really zero in on, because I will, for a point of comparison, what you just said, and that is the federal government gave the money to counties instead of the state, and whatever the politics was around that, we can say for another day. But that's what the feds did, and let me give you an example. That's sort of like the feds giving the money to the Board of Supervisors in Harrison County, and then sort of forcing Biloxi and Gulfport and Long Beach and Pass Christian to have to somehow coordinate with the county. The problem with that scenario is that the county's got different goals than the cities. You end up with an impasse, or more severely, you end up with tremendous conflict that somebody's got to go in to get in the middle of. So I think it's frankly, from my experience after Katrina, it's a terrible thing to give the money straight to one public entity when there were multiple public entities that were impacted. That's why the state's role in that is so critical. And if they do that again in Ian, it's just going to make things super complicated for the recovery effort.
It will. I mean, these are very complicated things because you're dealing with programs that are incredibly prescriptive, and the regulatory environment around is very tough, and the administration of these funds is very tough. And it's difficult to make things eligible for expenditure. And once you make them eligible, it's difficult to actually get them all the way to close out. Of course, we did $5.5 billion in projects in South Mississippi using just community development block grant money before you look at the other $20 billion or so in FEMA money and social services block grants and all the things that came after that. And so It's going to be very, very interesting to watch. And I have a strong feeling this is going to be a hot topic of conversation in the presidential race for the next several months to come as this recovery continues.
Yeah, talking about those block grants, incidentally, the federal block grants, we know them as CBDG funds, and what the state of Mississippi did to innovatively use those funds to help in so many different ways, man. I mean, again, there had to be some trust, though, didn't there, between the federal government and the state, that the state was going to do the kind of things that were going to address the kind of problems that we were discovering as we sort of went through the recovery effort. And that trust was kind of one of the keys to helping make that work, wasn't it?
It was, and of course, my experience leading the Office of Recovery for all those years, we had a switchover from the Bush administration to the Obama administration right when we were smack dab in the middle of the recovery process. So all the things that we made, the Bush administration comfortable with, we then had to turn around and work with the Obama administration. But I'm happy to report we were very successful in that. I mean, we got good cooperation both from the Republican administration and Democrat administration. And a lot of that is because I think they saw that Haley Barbour was doing an incredibly competent job of trying to bring the state back. And so, look, if you've got partners, if the federal government will be partners in the effort, there's nothing you can't do.
There's nothing you can't do. And again, one of the keys to Haley's incredible success as a leader on our behalf is launching the Governor's Commission on Recovery, Rebuilding, and Renewal so we could build a plan from the ground up. Because one of the things he always said is that coastal Mississippians will be responsible for coastal Mississippi. He's not going to come in and tell us we need to go this way or that way. I did write in the book that there was, he knew when to apply the pressure, because there were some times when the debates would get kind of a little too heated and we needed to make a decision for just from a pure financing point of view, like the Ocean Springs Bridge being one of those moments when there was a tremendous debate. But he thought the debates were great. He thought the debates were really important to the community of coastal Mississippi, because it created an opportunity for us to decide what do we want to be when we grow up, meaning what do we want to be when we recover from this, how do we want to turn the corner, and how are we going to do that collectively? So the democracy, that's why I think the role of the Sun Herald was so important in this, by the way, because we were working so hard to cover these public meetings and help people get the information they needed so they could be engaged in the kind of community they wanted to have. When we come back on the other side, we'll continue our conversation with Ashley Edwards and talk about the election, the recent election in Mississippi, and how that might have been a harbinger for what we're going to see happen across the United States. We'll see you after this break. I just got a note from a listener, Ashley Edwards, the former CEO of the Business Council. He's an entrepreneur. He's involved in a lot of recovery efforts around the country. But Ashley's got a note from a listener that's making a recommendation about something having to do with insurance. I hear from a lot of people who listen to this show very carefully. And, one of the things this show's kind of proven is that people like to say that people have short attention spans, and that's true of some people. But there are a lot of people who actually want longer form. They actually read. They read a lot. They're thinking about these things. They listen to shows like this where they can hear from leaders and learn from their experiences and come to the appreciation when you look at the accumulation of all these conversations over the past 3 years, what it takes to build a community like ours. It really does take a lot of leadership and a lot of people to do that. Hey, Ashley, let's shift gears if you don't mind. I do think the recent election, I was very strong in saying that I didn't like where the lieutenant governor's race went. I didn't like how negative it got. I didn't like the lies that were being told. I didn't like dark money coming rushing into the state, and so on and so on and so on. I think it turned out well, but I was most happy with the fact that, as I made a post afterwards, that the electorate, you can trust voters. I think you can trust voters usually to make the right decision. And they got overwhelmed with all this junk. They sorted through it, and the majority of Mississippians chose well. And you think that might be sort of a harbinger. So talk about sort of this column you wrote.
Well, I think that what you see happening in Mississippi is what you're going to see happen all over the country in a number of the races that are coming up. And, what you had in the lieutenant governor's race specifically was you had a very dependable conservative in Delbert Hosemann and a challenger who was kind of running to the right of Delbert Hosemann. And so, it's not, you're not in a situation in this day and age in which Republicans are worried about people that are going to challenge them in a primary and kind of run to the center of where they are, especially in a state like Mississippi. That's exactly what we see happening in the presidential race. That's exactly what we see happening in some of the key Senate races around the country. And so the real question, I think, on the minds of a lot of the political watchers are, what is the American electorate going to do, and what is the Republican electorate going to do? As you mentioned when we started off the show, the Republican debate was this interesting kind of microcosm of this race to see how the numbers moved after the debate was over. And Trump has been very solidly in the lead, comfortably in the lead now, although you could argue that he's hit his ceiling, and you continue to see his numbers kind of backing up from that ceiling. And, there are two camps of Republicans. There are the Republicans that think Donald Trump's a shoo-in and he's the only guy we should nominate. There's a whole other camp that I probably associate with a lot more that says, I just think he's got a math problem in winning a general election, given all the data. It's not I have my own personal judgments about Donald Trump and his policies and things of that nature. But beside those, forget who's good, who's right and who's wrong. This is math at the end of the day in a general election scenario. And his ability to win the race in 2024 is even more challenged than it would have been in 2020, given everything that's going on. And we still have such a horizon before that election actually occurs. Those numbers are going to continue to move. And so the question is going to be, is the Republican Party, at least on the front end, going to go with a candidate who kind of has all those questions about their general election winnability swirling around them, or will they choose a more reliable, conservative voice that has a greater chance in the general election? I made the comment, you look at Nikki Haley, who was at 3% in the polls before the debate. After the debate, she was up around 9% or so, which is still not anywhere close to Trump's numbers. But her general election polling looks a lot better than Donald Trump's against Joe Biden. And, we've talked a lot about Haley Barbour. Haley Barbour used to always say, look, elections are about winning. It's not about philosophical battles. The only way that you get your policies in place and your philosophies in place is to win elections. And so the question is, how winnable is this election going to be for the Republican Party, depending on who that eventual nominee is? And, the smart money right now is that that'll be Donald Trump, but there's still a long time for those numbers to move, and a lot of things that are going to happen between now and then that are going to help move those numbers.
Well, listen, I've had discussions with some of my friends on Facebook about this, but I'll just come at it from a pure objective point of view. I once wrote a column about how policy matters and how Trump would get reelected. This was before some of the mess around all the stuff that we're learning about him, that policy matters. And it was shared on Facebook, Ashley, over 3,000 times, man. I mean, it just every single state, someone in every single state shared it. So that's where I was. But where I am today, I get this, and my friends don't want to hear this. At least some of my friends, a growing number of them do get it, incidentally, that Trump can't be elected and 50% of Republicans are looking for an alternative. And that's why I think you're going to see his numbers continue to fall. You're going to see someone in that group is going to emerge, and then others got to start dropping out. So we can't be thinning that. We need a good debate in this country about where we want to go from here. Listen, Ashley, it's been a pleasure to catch up with you, my friend.
Ricky, thanks for having me, and always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you very much.
You bet. This has been Ashley Edwards. He's a coastal entrepreneur. In fact, he's doing work all over the United States these days, but former CEO of the Coast Business Council and a friend. Have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.